Hi, folks. It's me. Who else, right? My name is Mike, aka Hey You, or the tall hairy guy. I hope you all can hear me all right. If you can't, just type something in the chat box like "Hey, what?" and we'll figure it out from there. Um, so thank you for coming. We got a few people here, and hopefully more will stumble in, but I appreciate you showing up. So we'll get started and see where we go. So the topic for this evening is on Snapseed. As you know, it's an imaging processing package. Before I get to that, I have a couple of housekeeping items to deal with. Um, One is that, as I mentioned, for anybody new, my name's Mike. I'm one of the event organizers for the group, and I've actually retired as the organizer 2 or 3 times now. And I came back when Meetup suggested that people start doing things virtually, and to be able to offer things like this, which is really ironic because I don't do cameras at all, period. On the day with Marcia and I got married, there were so many cameras there, it looked like a paparazzi event. I told people they could photograph me for one day. Anyway, so just before we get started, I just wanted to remind people that, we have something like 2,500 quote unquote members in this group. And there are usually about 30 people who are active, but anybody who wants to and has the interest to do so can run a meetup, whether that's a virtual one like this, whether it's a socially distanced photo walk, whether it's an idea for a photo challenge. There are no us and them in this group. There's just us, and so the group lives or dies based on what people contribute to it. So if you have any ideas or suggestions or things you want to contribute, you should send a message to Tim Campbell. He's the Grand Poobah. And speaking of Tim, it does, even though we're meeting virtually and it doesn't cost us anything to rent this particular space, being a member of Meetup does have annual dues, and Tim pays those out of his own pocket. He doesn't seem to mind that, but if you want to contribute anything to that, then contact him, and he'll let you know where to go from there. So this is the third meetup of this variety that I've done, and I still offer to do one on digital asset management in Capture One somewhere down the road. And our last housekeeping item, normally I would point you to where the bathrooms are, but well, you're going to have to find them on your own. So Snapseed, yeah. As I mentioned in the introduction for this chat, I do almost all of my um, post-processing work on my computer. Reason being that you've got much bigger screens to work with, a much more powerful processor, and much better software. But Snapseed has several advantages as well as disadvantages. The disadvantages, of course, being the aforementioned small screen and limited capability in comparison to something like Photoshop. The advantages are that it's much cheaper, it's free, and B, it has a much simpler interface than something like Photoshop or Affinity Photo or Lightroom, Capture One, whatever you're used to. It still has a good range of tools that you can use. So you can install Snapseed on your Android phone, on your iPhone, iPad, Android tablet, your Mac computer, your Windows-based computer, and there are going to be some slight differences between them. So I'm going to be demonstrating on my Samsung Galaxy S6, which is an older Android phone. It's got a 16 megapixel camera, and it's as far as the phone goes, it works well for me. Apparently the new Samsung Galaxy S20 has a 108 megapixel camera, and well, there's 3 varieties. The biggest one has 108 megapixel camera, and twice the sensor size. I'm still in the camp of I'll believe it when I see it, because uh, my Sony A7R3 has a 42 megapixel sensor. So I have a feeling that Samsung is doing something a little hunky behind the scenes. But anyway, so before we get started on Snapseed, because we're talking about image processing, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention. One is color management, and color management is basically ensuring you have consistent color. It's not about accurate color. It's about having consistent color between your camera, your screen, and your printer, if you are in fact a printer. And if you are interested in serious photography, you should get something like this, which is the X-Rite i1 Display Pro. This is a colorimeter. You can also get a spectrophotometer. They're more advanced and more expensive. There are a couple of other companies that make colorimeters as well. Basically, what this does is it reads the colors being emitted by your screen, and it sets up a table that allows the computer to give you more accurate color based on whatever your monitor is capable of putting out. And the reason I'm mentioning that now, because even though we're talking primarily about cell phones and tablets, is that if you have this particular device, the X-Rite i1 Display Pro, X-Rite actually makes an app for your phone, and you need depending on the connections that your phone has or your tablet, you might need an adapter, but you can actually plug your colorimeter into your phone and calibrate your phone screen. I haven't done that for my phone. I do it for my monitor, my computer monitors. The reason I haven't done it for my phone is that A, I'm doing all of my major processing on the computer, and B, I've been blessed to have very high visual acuity. A great number of people are colorblind, mostly men, more men than women, but I'm not. I actually have very high color acuity. So if it doesn't look right to my eyes, then I have a better than average chance of saying that it's not right. So my phone screen looks good to me. Okay. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention before we get too far, I'm just going to bring up an image here, is that we're going to talk about the histogram in Snapseed. And the histogram basically shows you the amount of light in your image that is black all the way through to white. And the histogram is broken down into 8 panels, something like this. So this is not the left side of your image and the right side of your image. This is the darkest parts of your image, and this is the brightest parts of your image. And histogram will describe an arc that looks something like that, depending on the image that you're working with. And this is important for several reasons. One, if the arc on your scale here goes off to this side or goes off to that side, then you have no information. You have pure black or pure white, and there's no going back from that. If you underexpose something a little bit, you can always stretch the histogram out and make it a little brighter. Or if it's too bright, you can pull it back a little bit to the left and make it a bit darker. And the other reason I wanted to pull this up is when we talk about processing, we're going to be talking about the brightest parts of the image, which are obviously the areas over here, the darkest parts of the image, which are the areas over here. And then we're also going to be talking about the midtones, okay, which are these areas in here. Now, you're not going to see this degradation in your histogram. This is just to give you an indication that it is broken down into roughly 8 categories. And image processing, for the most part, is all about contrast. Now, if your contrast is too high, then you end up with something like this. You have black and you have white. If your contrast is too low, then you end up with something like this. You don't have an image, you just have a gray box. Okay. Depending on the camera that you have, and in the film days, we had generally about 5 to 7 stops of separation. This is called a dynamic range. Not every image is going to have a really dark area. Not every image is going to have a really bright area. Dynamic range is not about how bright it is or how dark it is. Dynamic range is the ability to separate light from dark. Okay. So down here we have basically 32 different gradations of white to dark. And if you can't see all of those different bars on your computer screen, then odds are that your screen is either too bright, too dark, or you've got the contrast turned up too high, which takes us back to the colorimeter. Again, this isn't something that you're often going to control with your smartphone, but if you have a computer, then you're going to want to look at that. So Snapseed is a way of processing images, as I mentioned. This is a before and after shot. Now, I'm not generally a big fan of the overly contrasty, burnt out, highly tone mapped view, but I wanted to show you just that, if this is your thing, then it is possible. This was the original image made with my phone, and this is an example of what could be done with it. It's not something I would normally do, but there's no setting on your phone, sport, night, black and white. There's no setting on your phone that's going to do this for you automatically. And that's why we get into post-processing. This is more of an example of the sort of thing that I do. Again, this is the original image shot with my phone on the left, and this is the same image processed in Snapseed. You can see down here, I took out the spots here, here, here. It's obviously a little brighter. If you look at the detail in the flower, it's a little sharper. And I've added, if you look up in the corner, you can see that I've added a bit of a black frame around it. So again, this was done in Snapseed. This is just one example of what's possible. This is another example made with my phone. This is my Waterman cartridge pen and in my notebook, and then I processed the image. You can see I've cropped it some, pushed the processing around a little bit, and then I added some text to it. So again, this was done in Snapseed, and this is just a couple of quick examples of what you can get into. One last image to pull up. This is two examples of the same image. This is the small fountain off Belleville Street at the Royal BC Museum. And obviously this one is much brighter than this one. In the film days, especially if you were shooting slides, it was common to slightly underexpose your image because it would bring out contrast and increase the saturation in your film. With digital, this is the worst thing you can do. And I'll tell you why, which is that two reasons. One, when you start to get too dark, you're going to get too much noise, color noise and luminance noise in your image. And the other thing is that, as I've mentioned in all my talks before, we look at this and we call it an image. This isn't actually an image. A digital image is just information. It's a bunch of electrical charges converted into ones and zeros, and then that information is sent using our computer software so that we can light up little colored dots on the monitor and make it look like a picture. Now, if we go back to our 8-bit histogram here, you may have heard the term ETTR. You may not have heard the term ETTR, but that's okay. It stands for exposed to the right. Okay. So obviously, if we underexpose an image, we're going to have much more of the image that's darker. And if we overexpose the image, we're going to have much more of the image that's brighter. And Dee asked me if I'm recording, and yes, I am. So it will be available as soon as this is over at the same link. Okay. And okay, so the idea behind ETTR is that when you expose your image, you want to expose as much for the highlights as possible without falling off the edge. Okay, because as I mentioned earlier, anything over here that's too bright is just null. There's no information, no data at all. And anything over here that's too dark, again, is no data, it's zero. Now, you've got these 8 columns, but the information is not spread evenly across all 8 columns, okay? 2/3 of your information is right here in this space, okay? And then it kind of goes down like that. So this channel, if you will, this brightest area contains twice as much information as this one, and this gray tone contains twice as much information as this one, and so on and so on and so on. So if you underexpose your images, you're going to end up with, if you imagine 8 glasses of water, and this one holds 1 liter, and this one holds 500 milliliters, and this one holds 250 milliliters, and 125, and 62, and 30, et cetera, on down. Then down here, you've got a very small glass. And if you try to pour too much information into that glass, it's just going to overflow and pour out. And this big glass over here that's waiting to gather all your information is going to be empty. Okay, so when you expose your image, you want to get it as close to the right without falling off the edge. And that's important. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. So we're going to close that. And now, before we get into working with Snapseed, just wanted to mention, perhaps overstate the obvious, which is that not all phones are created equal. Yes, Dee, I do have some experience with Affinity, but that's a Windows or an iMac-based program, and right now, tonight, we're talking about cell phones. If you have any questions about Affinity, I may or may not be able to answer them, and you can send me a message through Meetup, and I'll do my best. Or if not, I'll be able to put you on to someone else who can help you. So let me just bring this up here. Okay, so good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, you should be looking at my cell phone. And just going to close that. Okay, so where are we here? Yes. So as I mentioned, this is my phone. This is a Samsung Galaxy X6. It has a 16 megapixel camera and 32 gigabyte solid state drive. It's not a hard drive. But your camera may be much newer and fancier than this one. It may be older than this one. It may be from a different company. It may be an iPhone versus an Android phone. It may be a tablet. And the reason I mention that, and is because what it looks like on my screen may be just a little bit different than what you see on your screen, but overall it should be the same, or at least similar. Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention about phones is if you have a phone, you have something called digital zoom with your camera app, whatever camera app you're using. Now, if you've got one of the newer phones, the iPhone 10 or whatever they're up to now, or the Samsung S10 or S20, this may not apply. But for older phones, at least, even this one, when you in your camera app, you'll have something called digital zoom. And digital zoom is a fancy camera term that means do not use. Okay, because when you use digital zoom on your camera, on your phone, all you're doing is you're taking the existing pixels and you're making them bigger. So you're lowering the resolution of your image as you zoom in on your subject. And you're much better off, if you're going to do that, you're much better off trying to do that with software either on your computer or even in Snapseed using the crop tool, because you'll make more efficient use of the data that you've captured. Once you click the shutter button on your phone or on your camera, you've captured all of the information you can get for that image. Okay, so you might as well capture all of the information that you can using ATTR, and by not using digital zoom. Again, it depends on your phone. The newer phones have a higher resolution camera. Some of them have more than one camera, and they use pixel binning and things like that to increase the resolution. But if you have an older phone, it's just not worth it, in my opinion. Okay, so good. Now, on your screen, you should see two icons in the middle. One is Snapseed and one is Gallery. And there are two ways to get an image into Snapseed. If you go into your gallery, and I go here to my camera app, I can just click on an image, like this one, for example, and I can click on the share button. And then I have a button called Snapseed, so I can just click on that, and it will open the image in Snapseed. Okay, that's one way to do it. Close that. Close that. And oops, sorry about that. I hit the wrong button. Just give me a second. Should not have closed side sync because that's what's sending the information to my camera or to my computer screen. So we'll get set back up here. Okay, once more with feeling. Okay, so sorry about that, but yeah, this should be working now. So the other way to get an image into Snapseed is just simply to click on the Snapseed icon, and it says tap anywhere to open a photo. So you do that, and you go to wherever your photos are and pick one, like that. Now, just going to cancel that for a second. The only real difference between opening, like starting Snapseed and opening an image and going to your gallery and then clicking share and open in Snapseed is down here on the bottom right where it says export. Okay. If you open Snapseed first and then open an image in Snapseed, you have an option when you click export here. Come on now. Wonders of modern technology. Okay, I'll try this again. So click on, as I mentioned, down here on the bottom right, it has an export button. And if you click on that, it's waiting for your screen to catch up to mine. Come on. There we go. Okay, so at the very bottom it says export as. And when you click export as, it allows you to do two things. One is at the very bottom where it says save. It allows you to create a custom file name for your image. And the other thing is at the very top where it says camera. If you click on that, you can choose a folder. So if I could go to my cell phone, I could choose a different folder, or I could even create a new folder. So it allows me to have a custom output. So I can save the images anywhere I want on my phone. If you just click export, or if you open your gallery and then share to Snapseed, excuse me, you don't have that save as option. You can, it will automatically save to your to a Snapseed folder on your phone, and that's really the only difference. Okay, so hopefully things will be working better now, and we shall continue on. Now, Snapseed. I'm going to close Snapseed here. Snapseed will work with some raw files, and I say some raw files because my as I mentioned, I have a Sony A7R III. Now, the raw files that come out of that camera are about 85 megabytes. And just for giggles, I copied a file onto my phone and tried to open it in Snapseed, and the little light on my camera came up, and it said, "You've got to be kidding me." So that obviously didn't work. I had some images from an old Fuji XE1. I tried opening those, and it wouldn't read them for some reason, which is surprising because that camera is several years old. So then I tried a Nikon D5000, and it did open those. And also my phone has the capability of capturing raw files as DNG, and I can open those raw files on my computer, or in Snapseed, I should say. And So it will work with some raw files. Whether or not it will work with your camera is something you'd have to check. The other thing I can do, even with my Sony A7R III, is I can connect my camera to my phone with a piece of software, and then I can export the JPEG from the raw file to my phone, and I can process the JPEG on my phone in Snapseed. So that's also possible. Okay, so if you open a raw file in Snapseed, like this, and we'll go back here and choose this one. It will open in the raw developer, and you can see on the bottom left side of the screen it says raw. And in the raw developer, we're not going to get into what a raw file is. Basically, a raw file is not a picture. As I mentioned, a raw file is just a bunch of information that we can make it look into a picture. In order to work with the raw data in an image processor like Photoshop or anything, we need to convert it into a format that the software can use. And so we need to assign a white balance to it. We need to set up a gamma. We need to do a variety of things. So if you open a raw file in Snapseed, you'll start here. And this is as good a place as ever to talk about the interface of Snapseed. So you'll notice up at the top it says exposure 0.00 EV. Down at the bottom you've got an X, you've got a bunch of little slider bars, you've got a WB, and you've got a check mark. And above that you've got a histogram. Now the histogram, as I mentioned, shows you where most of the information is in your image, and as you push the data around, that histogram will move. So if we click on the little sliders here at the bottom, it pops up and it shows me that we have exposure, highlights, shadows, contrast, structure, saturation, temperature, and tint. Okay. Now, temperature and tint relate to the white balance of the image. And the 4833K is degrees Kelvin. Daylight temperature at the equator at noon is considered 5,000 degrees Kelvin. As it gets more towards evening, then it starts to get warmer. So it could be up to 6,000, 7,000 degrees Kelvin. If we're into the blue hour in the evening, then it starts to get cooler, and we could be down to 3,000 degrees Kelvin. Basically, the temperature slider makes the image, the white balance, either more yellow or more blue, and the tint slider makes it more cyan or more magenta. Okay. Now, if you want to do the quick and dirty method, if you press the WB button, stands for white balance, you have auto white balance, as shot, which is what the camera set the white balance as when you took the picture. Now, RAW files have no white balance built into them. JPEGs, when you shoot a JPEG, it adds the white balance at the time of capture. You can still change it, but it's set into the file at the moment of capture. RAW files don't have a white balance. So we have auto, we have sunny, cloudy, shade, tungsten, which is interior daylight, fluorescent, you know what fluorescent is, and flash. So if I click flash, you can see that it's made the image look more purple. If I hit fluorescent, it's definitely more um, magenta. Tungsten makes it more blue because tungsten tends to be about 3,500 degrees Kelvin, and we want to add blue to the yellow to make it neutral. Okay, shade is going the other way, so if we click shade, then we're telling the camera, the software, that the image is bluer than it should be, and we need to make it. So these are options. You can also, there's a little color picker here. If you click on that, you see the little red square in the middle. You can move that around the image and try and find a neutral point, and it will set the white balance based on where you set it. And close the picker. If you want to get a little bit more advanced, see now you can see that it's changed our color temperature to 5,000 degrees Kelvin. If you want to get more advanced, well, and I should mention, when you're working in Snapseed, you move your finger, or if you have something like this is a stylus, and this is actually a Wacom bamboo stylus duo, and so I use this because I have big fingers, but in the interface in Snapseed, if you move your finger or the stylus up and down, you switch between the different settings. Once you pick the setting, if you move the stylus left to right, then you will change the value. So as you can see, I've increased saturation all the way up to 100, or I could pull saturation all the way down to 0. Okay. So left to right changes the value, up and down changes the tool that you're using. Okay. Now, if I decide I didn't want saturation to be minus 100, I could either move the stylus back to the right and bring it back towards 0, or I can just double tap at the top of the screen where it says saturation +7. If I just double tap on that, it sets it back to 0. Okay. The other thing to notice is at the bottom of the screen right now, you've got a box with a blue box inside of it. So if you double tap on the screen, you can zoom in to 100%, or you can zoom out. If you zoom in, then the blue box shows you the area of the image that you're looking at, and you can move that blue box around the screen. If you're zoomed in, you have to move that blue box to move around the image. If I go outside that box and start moving, then I'm going to adjust the slider, or I'm going to pick a different slider. Okay, so if you're zoomed in, you have to move to see a different part of the image. You have to move that blue box around. Okay, if you have a touch screen device like an iPhone or an Android phone, as I mentioned, double tapping will zoom you into 100% and back out. But you can also use the two-finger spread to zoom in more. Okay, there's a maximum that you can zoom in, and again, you're looking at a much smaller part of the image now. But again, double tapping will take you back to 0. Okay, so in the raw processor, you want to set your white balance. You can set the other sliders if you want. It depends on the type of work that you do. For this image, I'd probably tone the exposure down a little bit. If we lost our histogram. Oh well. Highlights look okay. Shadows, maybe add a bit there. It's not really that important because as soon as you click done, then you're going to go into the main interface. So as I mentioned, at the bottom of the screen, you have an X and a check mark. If you hit the X, you can back out of whatever tool you're in without doing anything. If you hit the check mark, then you commit to it. Now I just backed out of my raw processor, but that's okay. I can come back into it. So now we're in the main Snapseed window, and at the bottom you'll see three things. You'll see styles, tools, and if you've opened the Snapseed app rather than sharing an image to the app, you'll have export. Oh, one more thing related to export, and it doesn't matter how you got the image into Snapseed, but if you go up to the very top right and hit the three dots and go to settings, under image sizing, you can decide when you export your image, do you want to export it at full size or at a smaller size? You can also choose whether you're exporting a JPEG or a PNG and what quality level. Okay, because images, I mean, it depends on where you're posting them and what the file size you're getting into and things like that. So, but that's under the settings menu. Okay, so at the bottom here we have styles, tools, and export. Now styles, you'll see above styles, you've got portrait, smooth, pop, accentuate, faded, glow, etc., etc. These are all presets. Okay, you click one and Snapseed will deliver that one. You click a different one, Snapseed will deliver that one instead. If you don't want to get into processing and you just want to push around a little bit, you can just use styles and you're done. Okay, you don't have to sit around for the next presentation. But if you want to get a bit more, then we use tools. Okay, so I'm not going to commit to any of these styles. I'm just going to hit the X. Now there is one thing to do with styles that we'll come back to later. But for now, we're going to move on to tools. Okay, there are 29 different tools in the Snapseed menu, and they all do slightly different things. Some of them are very similar. If you opened a raw file rather than a JPEG, you will have the raw developer. So I could go back to this. Here's my histogram. I could go back to this. I could go back to my temperature slider, and I could change the white balance. Not that much, maybe around there. And that's fine. So we'll start with that. I made it a bit warmer. Okay. If you open a JPEG, you will not have the raw developer. Okay, so the next tool is to tune image. And this is very similar to what you had in the raw developer. So if we click on, now again, at the bottom, you'll have the X and the check mark to either back out of the tool or to commit to the tool. Excuse me, you'll have the sliders, you have your histogram, and then beside that, there's a magic wand. So if you hit the magic wand like that, Snapseed will automatically set the sliders to what it thinks is appropriate for this image. It has no idea what it's looking at. It's just trying to maximize, based on some software, what it thinks are the best options. So you can go through and change them. You click the sliders. Okay, so let's say we've got brightness -1. That's fine. Contrast is at 42. That's probably a little high. I'm going to back that down to about 30 maybe. There we go. Saturation, there's a bit of color in the clouds. We can maybe push that up a little bit. Now ambience, if you look at this image, if you look at the histogram, you'll see a lot of data in the middle of the histogram. Okay, there's two big spikes in the middle. There's nothing too bright and nothing too dark. What ambience does, by moving the ambience slider left and right, you're either going to push those midtones closer to each other or you're going to stretch them apart. Okay, so if I move my stylus to the left, then you'll see that the midtones are starting to stretch apart. And if you look at the image, you can see that it's becoming not necessarily brighter or darker, but much more contrasty. Okay, so there's a bigger variation between light and dark. That's ambience at minus 100. Now, if I go the other way and slide my stylus to the right, then you can see it's pushing the midtones together. So now it's removing some of the contrast and pushing all that information towards the center. Again, it's not affecting the darkest areas of the histogram or the brightest areas. It's only working with the midtones. Okay, so for this image, I would probably go about there. Okay, so next we have highlights. Now the highlights are the brightest parts of the image. So if we crank this all to the way to the right, you can see the histogram moving on the bottom. And now if we get up to highlights plus 100, you can see there's a real tall spike right at the very edge of the graph. That's what you do not want to see. Because when you see that, that means you've got a lot of data. You've got a lot of pure white in your image, and pure white has no information. So we can tone this down a bit, maybe to there. So now we don't have anything that's pure white. Not that we haven't lost any information, but we've brightened up the image considerably. And it depends on the image and what you want it to look like, whether you increase your highlights, decrease your highlights. It depends on also on how you exposed it in terms of did you overexpose your image, did you underexpose your image? So that's highlights. Shadows is the same thing for the darkest tones. So again, if I slide my shadows all the way down to minus 100, you can see that the darkest part of the histogram has stretched now all the way to the left border. Okay, and there is some pure black in there. It's not a lot, but there's a little bit of a spike just at the bottom. So if we pull that back a bit, so now we have nothing that's pure white or pure black, but we've increased the overall contrast in the image by using the ambience. If we go back to ambience now, we can change this to make the image look a little bit like we have more definition in the clouds or less definition in the clouds. When I showed an example of this, I had it overly tone mapped, so it had quite a bit of definition, but we'll leave that about there. Okay, so that's all of those sliders. Warmth, again, makes your image slightly bluer or slightly yellower, so you can make it, depending on what you're looking for. In this one, I could, turn the warmth down a little bit and make the scene more blue. Or if I was shooting a sunset, I could increase the warmth and make it a bit more yellow. I think neutral is probably about there. So now we're done with the that set of tools, so we can hit the check mark. And now we've committed to that setting. Okay. Now, if you long press on the image, it will come up and show you the before and after. And you can do that at any point. So what do we got here? The next tool after tune image is details. Now, details are for sharpening, and generally you're going to do your sharpening at the end of your processing because you don't want to introduce artifacts into your image. There are two sliders in details, sharpening and structure. What sharpening does is sharpening improves the contrast along edges. So if you look at the clouds in the top middle of the film, if we were to, of the image, let's just zoom in here for a second. If I was to increase the sharpening, and I'll go way beyond what I would normally do, but you can see how the edges of the clouds have become much more defined. So sharpening increases edge definition. It adds more contrast along light and dark edges. If you go too far, excuse me, you can get what's called haloing, where you end up with light spots in the darkest parts of your image and dark spots in the lightest parts of your image. And that's an indication that you've over sharpened. There's no set value for sharpening. It depends on your camera. It depends on the output of your image. It depends on a variety of factors. If I was going to sharpen this image, I would probably set it to about there. You should always do your sharpening at 100%, and that way it gives you a better view of what it is that your output's going to be looking like. So we go down to structure, and now structure adds, how would I describe it? It also adds contrast, but it's not as fine. It's a bit more, well, for lack of a better word, rough. So again, if we push the structure all the way up to 100, you can see that it's gotten much more granular. Okay, and that's not what we're looking for. At least that's not what I'm looking for. But so again, it's increasing edge contrast, but it's doing it in a much rougher manner. So if I was going to sharpen this image, now you can, if you want, go to negative sharpening, and that will give you negative structure, and that will give you kind of a blur effect. But if I was going to sharpen this image, I would probably go to about there. Okay. Now, the best way to do sharpening, go back to our sharpening tool here. The best way to do sharpening is to actually start at 0 and then move. In this case, you're moving the slider to the right. And if you're working in a different software package, you're probably using a slider as well. But you move it to the right until you get to the point where you say that's too much. And then you start backing it up until you say to yourself that's not enough. And then you go a little bit forward, and then you go a little bit backwards. And finally, you'll start to get an idea, and you'll say, yeah, that's probably good about there. That's the best way to do sharpening. Go too far, go back and go, no, that's not enough, and then go forward again, not quite as far, and back, and then you'll kind of, it's like a pendulum coming down to 0. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, sharpening is one of the last things you should do, so I'm going to reset that to 0. And we'll move on to our next tool. Okay, the next tool, we're just going to cancel that. The next tool is the curves tool. Now, curves have been around a long time. They were one of the original tools in Photoshop back, 30 odd years ago. And the way curves work, curves curves are a workshop in themselves, basically, but we'll cover it very quickly. Basically, we talked about the histogram earlier, and you can see the data that you've got for this particular image overlaying. I'm just going to zoom out here. You can see the histogram overlaying on the bottom, and then we've got these data points, these white circles. Now, on the bottom left of your screen is black, and on the top right of your screen is white. Okay, so if we go here and go to, go to neutral. So now, get rid of that. What we have is basically a flat line. So there's no variation in contrast across the screen. Okay, turn that back on so you can see it. If I move the black point up, then I'm removing pure black from the image. If I go all the way up to 50%, then I've got nothing from 0 to 50% black in my image at this point. If I move the white point down, then I'm removing all the brightest information in the image. And if I go like that, now my white point and my black point are both at about 50%, and I have 0 contrast. So what you're looking at is a gray blob. Okay, so we'll put that back up, put that back down, and you can do this in lower increments. So if I had some really, like if I look at this spot down here, for example, let me just get rid of that, zoom into that rock, which is very black. Go back to my histogram. If I start to increase that a little bit, you're going to see that we're starting to lose that absolute black definition. So you can play around with that a little bit. If I move the black dot to the right, then basically I'm extending how much of the area is black. So if I go all the way to the middle, say there, now 50% of my image, like 50% of my tones from zero pure black to 50% gray is now all black. And if I do the same thing with the white slider, it won't let me go all the way to 50, but basically I've got as close as I can to 100% contrast in this image. It looks pretty horrible, but that's basically what that does. Now you can add, those are the absolute endpoints. You can add other points on your screen by simply clicking on them, and if you drag that point up, it makes it brighter, and if you drag that point down, it makes it darker. Okay. I can also move points, and I could go like that and like that, and now I've added some brightness to the later areas, and I've added some darker stuff to the lower areas, so I've increased the contrast. Okay, there are, on the bottom, there's what looks like a cell phone with two little marks beside it, right beside the check mark. If you click on that, it has a number of built-in presets. Okay, so soft contrast, brighten, you can see that there's one point, let's just hide that, one point that is above the center line, so you've added brightness to your image. Curves, in a way, replicate what we were doing in the previous tool, in the previous tool, by adding highlights, shadows, everything like that. But you can do a lot more with curves, and you can do it with a lot more finesse. Now, the little eyeball in the middle turns on and turns off the tone curve, so you can see it. And then to the left of that, you've got RGB, red, green, blue, and luminance. Okay, so what you're looking at in terms of color on the screen are three different colors blended together. Okay, that's what your camera captures. Is it captures red light, green light, and blue light. Actually, there's filters over the sensor that filter out red light, green light, and blue light. But we're not going to get into that. But that's how your camera sees. This is in those three colors. So if you choose RGB, then you're adjusting the red, green, and blue colors together. Okay. Now you can, depending on how you mess with the tone curve, you can get some color shifts that way. Over here on the right, it says luminance. And if you click on luminance, then if I make any changes to my histogram, I'm only affecting the gray tones. I'm not changing the relationships between the colors at all. I can make it brighter. I can make it darker. I can make the brighter areas brighter. See, like so. Okay. But if you select luminance, you're only affecting the gray values from black to white. If you select RGB, you're affecting the red, green, and blue channels together, but you can get color shifts. The other option is to pick an individual color. So if I pick red, now you can see I've got a red line and a red histogram. So if I drag a point above that line, I'm going to increase the red value in that part of the image. So if I do this, you can see I'm making the image more red. If I do this, I'm removing red from the image, okay, and making it more cyan. Let's go back to our neutral. If I go to green, same thing. I can increase and decrease. So now I've increased the green in the brighter areas and decreased the green in the darker areas. Anyway, that's, as I say, curves are a talk all into themselves. So we're just going to leave that there, and that's what they do. Okay. So we covered the next tool is the white balance tool. And we covered that in the raw developer. But again, you have auto white balance. If you click on auto white balance, then the Snapseed will set it to whatever it thinks is appropriate for that image. That may not be right depending on the look that you want. So we're just going to reset that and reset that. Okay. And you also have the color picker. Now, you've got, when you click the color picker, you've got that red square in the center. And you want to move it around so that you find something that is a neutral gray color in your image. And as you move it, you'll see in the magnifier, it's not really a magnifier, it's more of a focuser, but there's a white ring and a black ring. And as you move it, that space in that ring will shift to show you the color that it's picking up. So if I move over towards the mountains, for example, you can see that the space in the ring is now quite blue. And what you're telling Snapseed right now is that that color is gray. So you're telling Snapseed that the image is much bluer than it actually is. And so it's adding more yellow, more red to compensate. That's why it looks so horrible. If I move down here to the surf, which is more or less white, then we get a much closer value. And you can, zoom in to 100% or even more, depending on your image. You can try and pick an accurate spot. Okay, so that's what that's for. So we'll consider that the white balance for this image, and we'll zoom back out. Okay, the next tool is the crop tool. Now the crop tool allows you to reformat your image. Okay, and you have a number of different choices, all the way from 16 to 9 to square, and they have different height and width ratios. So if you're making an 8 by 10 print, you need a 4 by 5 aspect ratio. If you're making a 5 by 7 print, you need a 5 by 7 aspect ratio. If you're making something for a widescreen computer or television, you need 16 by 9. Okay. On the bottom, you've got a little arrow. If you hit that, you can change the crop aspect. Okay. So if I only wanted to use a part of this image, I could rotate it, and then I could end up with an image that looked like that. You can also use the corner handles to manually resize and reshape the image. So if we were to choose a 3:2 aspect ratio, we decided we didn't want that rock, for example, or we wanted to focus on the clouds, maybe get rid of that beach. One thing to be aware of is that if you crop away from the edges of your image like this, you're throwing away information. There's nothing you can do about it. But when I talked about digital zoom on your phone and not using digital zoom, this is going to do a much better job of zooming in than your camera app will. Okay, so if you need to zoom in, shoot the image wide open. Most cell phones have, wide angle lenses. Newer cell phones have sometimes 2 or 3 different cameras with different lenses, and so you can get a closer focus. But if you have an older phone especially, and you need to zoom in, then shoot the image wide and then crop it later, because it will work with the information better than your camera app can. Okay, so that's what the crop tool is for. There are a number of presets, as I say. One of the limitations of Snapseed is that you can't create your own presets, but there is a free, and free means that you can set it to any ratio you want. Okay. Now, if you move one of the quarter handles, you can move it in or out. If you put your finger or your stylus in the middle of the image, and then you can move the box around. So you can change like that. Okay, we're not going to keep this crop, but that's what that's for. Okay, you've got two tools following that: rotate and perspective. They do similar things, but there are a couple of important differences. So we'll cover rotate first because it's the simplest one. Now rotate, you can see at the top it says straighten angle minus 1.5 degrees. It's looked at this image and it said to itself, that looks like the horizon, and the horizon is crooked. Okay, so if you hadn't noticed it, we back out of that and you can see that the horizon is definitely sloping down toward the left. Okay, so if I click on rotate, it's going to rotate the image to make it level. Okay, you'll also notice around the outside edges of the image that it's cropped off. It's had to crop off information from the edges in order to make that the horizon straight. Okay, and within the rotate tool, you can also, there's two triangles that will flip your image back and forth. Okay, and you've also got a rotate tool. You can rotate it 90 degrees at a time. Okay, so you can turn it upside down. Sometimes, depending on how you're holding your phone, you'll end up with a landscaped image that should be portrait or vice versa. But the important thing to notice here, two things to notice, is one is it does the straighten angle automatically. You can also, if you want to, you can manually try to change the rotation angle. Okay, let's go back to rotate here and let it do its thing. So that's one thing to notice. And the other thing is that, as I mentioned, it's chopped off information from the sides. Okay. Now we're going to back out of that and go back to our angled horizon for a moment, because the next tool is perspective. Now perspective has four different tools. If we go to rotate, by moving the stylus or your finger left to right, we can rotate the image. Okay. And there's no horizon auto straighten like there is in the rotate tool, but you'll notice as we're rotating here that you're getting black triangles in the corners. Okay, now it's going to put that back pretty close to where it was. At the bottom, at the very center, you've got a square within a square. If you click on that, it says smart, white, and black. Okay, so much for being an hour, folks. I thought I could get this done quicker than this, but we'll just keep going for a little bit as long as people are still with me. Now, if you click white and we go back to rotate, and you let go, it will leave the triangles there as white. If I check black, it will set them black. If I click smart, it's like a content aware fill. It will try to fill in those spaces based on the pixels that are around the edge. Okay, so if I click smart, watch what happens. Okay, so it's tried to fill in the blanks, and if we zoom in, no, no, it's not letting me zoom in. Okay, well, trust me, how well it works depends on the image. So we're going to cancel that for a second. We'll zoom in. I'll go up here to the top right. I'll go back to our perspective tool, and it's going to zoom out again. Okay, it only works at full screen. But so the rotate tool again has an auto straighten function. But you'll lose data in the corners. The perspective tool rotate, you have to do it manually, like like so, but it will try to fill in the gaps if you tell it to. Okay. The other option is tilt, and tilt allows you to, if you have an image that has a building, for example, that you've angled your phone up at, and it's leaning in towards the corners, or if you have, actually, we close that. We go to a different image here. This one will work. Okay, so we'll go to Tools, and we'll go to Perspective. Okay, so now if I go to Rotate, I can rotate it. That looks pretty good. But you can see that because of the structure of the box and because of the wide angle lens, the police call box looks wider at the top than it does at the bottom. That's called keystoning. Every time you look up at a tall building, you get keystoning. Your eyes automatically adjust for it, but the camera doesn't. Let me get this out of your way so you don't have to look at it. There we go. So if we use the perspective tool with tilt, we can try to bring this back to make it nice and straight, something like that. Okay. If we had been standing to one side of the police box to the other, then we may have had, and again, you can see at the top left of the screen where that dashed line is, that it automatically filled in the corners. If I went to white, you would see the triangles that were created by tilting the image back. Okay. But if I was standing to one side or the other, I could use the perspective tool and I could rotate the image to make it line up or not, depending on what you're looking for. Okay, so if we decide we want to get a bit of an angle to it, it's whatever you're looking for. Now, one thing to be aware of in terms of keystone correction is that if you try to make a very tall building look straight up and down, it's going to look weird because the perspective will be off. So depending on your image and depending on what you're working with, you need to, rather than having it look like that, you may want to bring it back, not all 100%, but just enough so that it looks proper. In this case, the police box is small enough that we can do it straight up and down, but if you're shooting a tall building, you'll want to leave it in a little bit of keystoning. Okay. Scale allows us to stretch the image one way, either side to side or up and down. So if we go up and down, we can compress it or we can stretch it. Okay. This is obviously making big changes with the data, but again, depending on the image and what you want to do with it, that may be valid. Okay. And then we can also make it really narrow or really wide, depending on what effect you're looking for. And the last one is free. Now with free, and you have to be, it's a bit finicky, but free allows you to take the corners of your image, each corner, independently. So if we wanted to get really picky about having our phone box line up to a specific grid value, we could do it like that. So those are the four options in perspective. So rotate has the auto straighten, and perspective allows you to do more, and it has the infill. Okay, so we should actually have go back here, and we'll just hit the auto. There we go, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, so the next tool is expand, and expand allows you to create more space around the image. So if you wanted to, if you're thinking about adding a mat, for example, then we can stretch out You can make it white, you can make it black, or again, if you just need to increase the space around your frame a little bit, but you want to fill it in, you can use the Smart, and again, it will try to infill it as best it can. Now, it didn't do a perfect job in this case because if you look at the circle, the orange circle on the right-hand side, it didn't interpolate it as a circle. So it's, it's a smartphone app. It's doing the best it can, but that's what the expand tool does. It allows you to expand your canvas size. Okay. Now, the next tool is selective, and selective allows you to pick certain colors in the frame and work just with them. Okay. So on the bottom, we've got a plus sign and we've got an eyeball. The eyeball basically turns the pins, the center pins for the selections off and on. So if we were to pick a spot like there, okay, you can hit us any spot on the screen to start with. And then if you put your finger or your stylus over it, you can move it around to somewhere more specifically. Okay, so if we had started down here on the rug, but we really wanted that green above it, we could slide up until we hit the green. And again, the ring around the point shows you what color you're on. Okay, so I'm going to move back to this box here. So now the selection point is on the dark blue. If you have that point selected and use two fingers and then spread them apart, you can see how much of the image or how little of the image you want to affect. Okay, so if I move this over to this orange carpet over here, it's by default going to affect not only that orange circle, excuse me, but also the orange carpet around it. So I can constrict that down to just dealing with the orange carpet. Okay, and I can create as many points as I want. Probably there's some limit, but go back here to the middle for a second. Now, for each point that I create, I've got four options. I've got brightness, contrast, structure, and saturation. And it's like anything else. If I move my finger or my stylus to the right, I increase brightness. If I move it to the left, I can decrease brightness. Okay. Now, it's only affecting a small part of the phone box because I had pinched down to a small circle. If I wanted to affect the whole phone box, I'd put it closer to the middle and then I'd expand it out. And now, if I increase brightness, it's going to increase the brightness of the whole phone box. But it's not adjusting the carpet or pretty much anything else because that color is pretty much unique to this image. So I can, again, moving up and down changes tools, so I can increase the contrast or decrease the contrast, maybe something like that. I can add saturation or decrease saturation, and I can increase or decrease the structure. Again, structure is edge contrast, but it's more gross. It's rougher. Okay, so that's that point, which covers the phone box. If I clicked on the plus sign again, I could take another point, say the orange carpet on the bottom, and I could decide that I wanted to darken the carpet. Okay. Now, you can see that in this case, I can actually cover quite a large area of the frame, and it spreads over most of the carpet. But if, hypothetically, you couldn't reach all of the areas of the image that you want. Let's say you could reach up to the edges of the carpet, but you couldn't reach the ceiling, which is basically the same color. What you can do is create another point up in the ceiling, hit the plus sign, create another point up in the ceiling, and then expand that out, and then try to remember what the settings you had for the carpet were. Or if we take this one and delete it, okay, we can take this point, and you can see we've turned down the brightness by 76%. If I tap on it, I've got cut, copy, delete, and reset. Okay, so if I click copy, then I can go up onto the ceiling and hit there and paste. And now I've created a second data point with exactly the same settings as the other one. And I can make as many of those as I want. I can just go here and paste. Okay, and you can. So I'll give you a better example actually of that. Um, we'll go back here, and we'll take every morning. Marcia and I have some fruit at breakfast, and I try to make them pretty. Um, so this one's called counter rotation. But if I go to tools here and I go to selective and click down here, and I crank this all the way down to minus 85, that darkens the bottom left corner of the background. If I go to copy, then I can go over here and paste, go up here and paste, and then go up here and paste. And now I've got 4 points that are turning the whole background darker. Okay, so that's, and again, if I click on it, any point, I can cut, copy, paste, delete, or if I hit this button, it will reset all the values, the brightness, contrast, and the values to 0. Back where it was. Okay, so now we've made that darker. Okay, somewhat similar to the selection tool, selective tool, is the brush tool. Now the brush tool, if you've worked with Photoshop or Lightroom or Capture One or Affinity Photo, then you're familiar with brushes. If you're not, the brushes in Snapseed are not as robust, but there are 4 brushes: dodge and burn, exposure, temperature, and that's color temperature. So again, yellow to blue, and saturation. Okay, and if we pick, say, exposure, for example, we have up to +1, +7, 0.7, 0.3 eraser, -0.3, -0.7, -1. Now, the thing with the brush tool in Snapseed is it's not very well defined because you're limited to your finger, or even with a stylus. If I was to go up here and set this to +1 and start painting, that's about as fine as I can get. Okay, so you're not going to be doing any fine brush work in Snapseed, but you can use it to, in gross terms. And if I go back down to eraser, I can go back and simply erase the brush that I've made. And the little eyeball over here is a mask. Okay, so if I go back up here, now we've got a red mask on a red background, so it's a little hard to see, but you can see the mask by turning it off and on. Okay, so that's the brush tool. As I say, it's not very defined, but if you're using it in general terms, for broad brush strokes, so to speak, then it'll work fine. Okay. The next tool is the healing brush, and it is, like in other programs, it's designed to do spot healing. So if we were to zoom in on this blanket, you can see there's a little pull in the threads there, and there's another one there. One suggestion, probably the only suggestion I make for the healing brush, is always zoom in as much as you can. So use the 2-finger spread to zoom in as much as you can. because, and I'll show you why. Let's just zoom out here. So if I click on that spot, you see the size of the spot that was generated, and you can obviously see where it made the correction. There's on the lower left, there's a bit of a wrinkle. If I zoom over that, then again, you can see where it's been done. Now there's an undo and a redo. So these two arrows on the bottom. So if I pick that spot and zoom in as far as I can and tap it, and then over here and take that one. Now I'm affecting a much smaller area of the image. So when I zoom out, it's not nearly as obvious. Okay. Again, depending on how detailed your what you're trying to fix is, you can sometimes get away with it at a lower zoom level, but I tend to zoom in as far as I can and go around and heal things that need to be healed. Okay, so that's the healing brush. Okay, so now we're getting beyond the basic tools. We're getting into some of the other ones. The next tool is called HDRscape. At the beginning, I demonstrated at the beginning, I demonstrated an overly tone mapped, and a lot of people, when you talk about HDR, a lot of people think about something that looks like this. That's not HDR per se. Again, going back to the film days, we had about 5 to 7 stops of dynamic range, and dynamic range again is the ability to separate dark tones and light tones. And so if you had a broad range of tones, say 12 stops, in a scene where you've got deep shadows and bright highlights, you had to choose either expose for the shadows and have your highlights blown out to white, expose for the highlights and have your shadows black. Those were your choices. And in the digital days, in the early digital cameras, and cell phones, again, have lower dynamic range. It depends on the phone that you have. But in the digital days, what you can do is you can create more than one image at different exposure values. So say 0 EV plus 1 EV, and minus 1 EV, etc. And then you can combine them in software and and create one image. That's HDR. Now, once you've got all this extra information, then you can start to stretch it and push it, and that's called tone mapping. So what most people think about when they talk about HDR is actually tone mapping. I just wanted to establish that. Okay, so we're going to open, go back to open this image, just to, we'll cancel out of the develop, but just to give you an idea, the HDRscape in Snapseed is a tone mapping app. Okay, so there are 4 different options. They all give you slightly different looks. Okay, and again, you have sliders. So we could pick the, we could pick people, for example, and then we could just take the filter strength and we could tone it down, so it's not quite as contrasty. Or if you're really interested, we could take the strong one and we could crank it up and make it really, Armageddon, whatever works. But that's tone mapping. It's become to be known as HDR, and whether or not you need to shoot HDR depends on your camera. I have an HDR app on my phone. I use it all the time. My Sony A7R III has 12 to 14 stops of dynamic range. If you happen to have the $50,000 for an IQ, what's the newest one, 350, they actually have, Phase 1 actually has a new feature that shoots two images at the same time and combines them in camera, and it gives you 18 stops of dynamic range. So shooting HDR with that camera is pretty much a waste of time. Okay. So that's HDR escape. Glamour glow is often used for portraits, but it doesn't have to be. So I'm going to go back and open. Oops, hang on. Jump picture. As my niece jumped in here. Back to open gallery camera. Okay, so this is a picture of Mars. Go away. And my wife. And this is New Year's Day at the Lieutenant Governor's house. It's my favorite picture. I take this picture on the balcony every January 1st, and it's my favorite picture of the year. But if we zoom in on her, she's obviously a stunning woman. But if we go to Glamour Glow, we can add a bit of a glow to her. Okay, we can go too far, in my opinion. Again, there are. Go away. Sorry. Um, Again, you have sliders. You can adjust the amount of glow from 0 all the way up. So I would probably take it and bring it up to maybe something like that. Give her a bit of a highlight. But you can also use Glamour Glow for other types of images. So if I close that, if I go back to gallery, if I go back to that fruit bowl, for example, and if we zoom in on it, maybe not quite that far. If we add a Glamour Glow to this, say 50%, and you can see the difference between that and that. Let's do this again. So there's the zoom out. That's with the glow, and then if we turn the glow down, so it's just adding a nice glow. It's mostly useful for portraits, but you can use it for flowers or for other types of images as well. Okay, so the next one is tonal contrast. Okay, we talked about contrast before and how contrast is variation between light and dark. Tonal contrast, and we also talked about the histogram. Tonal contrast allows you to adjust the contrast in the brightest parts of your image, the middle tones of your image, and the lowest tones of your image. Okay, so if I take the high tones, and you're going to want to look at the pairs here, for example. By cranking this up, I'm increasing the contrast in just the brightest parts, okay? Or I can lower the contrast. No, I can't, okay? But I can increase just the highlights. I can increase the contrast just in the midtones, just in the low areas. And then down here it says protect highlights and protect shadows. So if I was to go here and push the highlights all the way up to 100, you can see that one slice of pear on the lower right side is pushed out to white. If I go down here and protect highlights, I can start to pull that back some, so it's not quite as egregious. Okay, it's still, I'd have to tone down the highlights some to get it, but that's basically, it allows you to adjust contrast in the different tones in different sections. You can do the same thing with curves, but it's a bit more finicky. So sliders, especially for newbies, are easier to use than curves. So we're going to clean back out of that one. So the next tool is Drama. Now there are a few of them in here that allow you to create Instagram type effects, and I don't spend a lot of time with them, so I'm not going to focus on them too much. You can look at them, see what they do. Again, you can adjust the filter strength for each one, and you can also increase or decrease the saturation, depending on what effect you're looking for. It's not something I use, but if it interests you, great. Okay, next tool is Vintage, and again, Vintage is designed to give you more of an older film look. So if you wanted a platinum tone to your image, or if you wanted a more sepia tone to your image, actually this isn't the best image to demonstrate with, so let's go back here and let's open this one, and we'll just brighten it up a little bit so that you can see what you're looking at. We're not going to worry about the clouds right now, but go back to vintage, and then we can add more of a sepia tone, or we can add, you know, more browns, more greens, whatever. It's just, you can see what they do. Again, I don't use them, but they're there. Grainy film. Again, there are presets and there are sliders. Different films, every different film had its own look, and some films, because a film was basically color-sensitive crystals, silver crystals, onto a piece of plastic. In order to make the film more sensitive to light, you had to use bigger bits of silver, and that ended up giving you a specific look. So um, you can, if you're trying to recreate that sense, you can add green to your images, or, you know, again, it depends on what you're looking at. I'm just gonna rush through these. Retrolux, again, gives you an old time look, more of a cross processing look. Every different type of film, whether it was color negative film or color slide film or black and white film, had different chemicals that it was used to process it. Sometimes people would, just for giggles, would take one type of film and process it in a different chemical. It was called cross processing. And they would get different effects, especially with color film. Now, the one thing I wanted to point out about this is, if you look at the number 5, it's got those 2 arrows on it. Okay, so we've picked that particular style in this case, but if we hit on it, the arrows will change the light leaks. Okay, the light leaks go back to, there were a number of different cameras. Hoya were probably the most popular, but they were plastic cameras, long before disposable cameras, and they were notorious for having light leaks. And again, these create a specific effect on your film. So if I pick number 3, and again, if by hitting this, it's just going to give me different choices. It's not something that I use, but if it interests you, it's there. Okay. Grunge, again, it's different effects, but these have overlays. So you can see there are five different overlays. You click on one, and then by hitting the 2 arrows, you can change the effects that you get. Again, not something I use, but it's there. Black and white. Okay. Black and white's actually a misnomer. The correct term is grayscale, because, but black and white has been around for decades, so we'll have to live with it. And again, you have a number of different presets that you can use to convert your image to black and white. And you also have other options that you can use. So in here, we've got film grain, contrast, and brightness. So we can increase or decrease the brightness. We can increase or decrease the contrast, bring back some of the sky. Okay, increase or decrease the green. Maybe not pull the contrast back so far, but you have other choices as well. So here are your presets on the right, and on the left we have colors. Now, even though this looks grayscale right now, there are still colors in this image. So these colors on the bottom here, red, orange, yellow, green, and blue, are like having a color filter in front of your lens. And that will render it will filter the colors of the light coming through the lens differently. So if we click red, if we zoom in on the flag here, we know that this is a red and white flag. So just put that down in the middle where you can see it. If we pick the red slider, then it's going to make the reds light. As we change the filters, it's going to change the colors, the shades, the tones. Okay. Now if we zoom out and go back and do the same thing, this giant sequoia in front of we know is green. So if we click on green, okay, it's not going to affect it that much. I've expected it to change it more. And even the shrubs in front, by changing the different color filters, we can affect the tones. Now, I should mention that there is a black and white slider in black and white tool in Snapseed. But if we go all the way back up here to tune image, for example, and if we go to saturation, if we crack saturation all the way down to 0, we've got a grayscale image. Okay, and the colors are still there, you just can't see them. So we could use the ambient slider, for example. We could maybe push the highlights, increase the shadows a little bit, and it's all. There are actually, I think there are 8. Let me see here. Yeah, tune image is one. The brush tool has a saturation brush, so you can reduce saturation. The drama tool has a saturation slider. The vintage tool has a saturation slider, and the Retrolux tool, the grunge tool, the black and white tool, they're all different ways of converting your image to black and white. And it's important to remember, as I said, the color information is still there, even though it's not showing it to you. It's showing it to you as grayscale. So if we were to take this grayscale image and go back to our curves and pick one of the color curves, like red, for example, okay, it's not doing what I expected it to do. It's adding red. Normally what it would do is it would affect the red parts of the grayscale. So forget I said that. Okay, so that's the black and white tool. The next one is called Noir, and again, it's a tool that allows you to create old film effects. Some of them you may like better than others. Again, this one has a wash slider, so it's like adding a wash was part of a film processing to, if we wash this, you'll see the changes. So it's basically shifting contrast. Okay. Yeah, that was our original image. Okay, so now the next tool is portrait. Now we need a picture with an actual face in it. And one thing to be aware of is that we had this image before, but Snapseed is not quite as good as face detection as some of the other packages like Lightroom or things like that. So if I go to portrait, it's going to try and find a face, and it's going to say, sorry, we can't find one. You can say try harder. In this case, it's going to go, no, can't do it. So this is not, you can't use the portrait tool with this image. You can use all the other tools, but you can't use the portrait tool. But since we're talking about the portrait tool, we'll use this image. This is Marcia, again, my lovely model. And this was our last free hugs campaign of this year. We've been doing this for 11 years. We've hugged people from at least 88 different countries, and we had to stop this year because of COVID. But anyway, so let's zoom in on Marcia's beautiful face here, and we'll go to the portrait tool. And the portrait tool, it's important to note, if we move Marcia's face over a little bit, maybe just back it out a tad. Okay. So now you can see her face and her hand, okay? So we've got face spotlight, skin smoothing, and eye clarity, okay? And we've also got presets. So spotlight, skin smoothing, eyes, combinations, stuff like that. You can start with any of the presets if you want, but If we do face spotlight, for example, by increasing it, we're going to make the face brighter. If we go to skin smoothing, we're going to smooth out the wrinkles. At some point, you get, it starts to look plastic, and you obviously wouldn't go there, wouldn't go that high. But we could do it a little bit. But it's going to affect her face. It's not going to affect her hand. Okay. If you were using Affinity Photo or Photoshop, you could be more specific with it. But that's basically, and if we zoom in on her eyes, I don't know how well it's captured her eyes. We'll find out. Yeah, it's starting to add a bit of edge contrast to her eyes and bring them out more. Okay, um, as as humans or as mammals, we tend to look into eyes. It goes way back in our history. Okay, so that's the portrait tool, and then beside that is the head pose tool. Now, the head pose tool to me is a little bit freaky, but I'll show you what it does. I'm just going to zoom out back to 100% and just put that slider there. Okay, I need you to watch her face as I move the slider around. If I move the stylus from left to right, I can actually move her head from left to right. Or if I move the stylus up and down, I can move her head up and down. As I said, it's a little bit weird, but that's what it is. But there's more. But wait, there's more. There are sliders for pupil size. So if we zoom in on her eyes, we can actually increase the size of the pupils. Now it's getting a bit confounded because of her glasses, so it's not working that well. But if we had a close-up of her face, then it would be able to adjust that. This is where it starts to get really freaky because we have a smile. You want to make her happier? Woohoo! Don't tell her I'm doing this, otherwise she's going to look like that. So I think this is a bit weird. I don't use it, but it's there. Okay. Um, and finally, because this is a wide angle lens, um, at close distances, wide angle lenses tend to distort things. So we can actually change the facial perspective. Give her a big nose. She's got such a beautiful, cute little nose. But anyway, so as I say, this tool kind of freaks me out a little bit, but that's what it does. Okay, that's head pose. Now there's lens blur, and there's, let's back out of that for a second. Get back to 100%. There's lens blur and there's vignette. And similar in the way that rotate and perspective are similar but different, lens blur and vignette are similar but different. Okay, so lens blur has an inner area, a transition area, and an outer area. It's basically a radial vignette. Okay. On the bottom here, we've got that little circle bullseye. If we click that, we also can create a linear vignette, linear gradient, sorry, radial gradient and linear gradient. And we can adjust the blur strength. So if we want to, if we go back here, if we were to put this over her and squeeze it in a bit, then we'd start to artificially create a shallower depth of field. With the lens blur tool, if you use two fingers, you can change the shape and the rotation of the vignette. Okay. If we set the blur strength to 0, we can still use the vignette to darken. Oh, sorry, I got the wrong one. Blur strength 0. Okay, 30 is the default. Go down to 0. Now we'll go to vignette strength, and we can create a vignette. So we could, for example, stretch this out, make it a bit wider, and then just darken the area around her. And that's pretty extreme, but you get the idea. Maybe move it up a little bit. And same thing with the linear vignette. We can rotate it. We can decide. Now, basically, the way linear gradients work is anything outside, so anything up at the top of the frame or anything at the bottom of the frame is 100% affected. From the bottom line to the next line is a transition zone. Between the two lines in the middle has 0 effect, and then another transition zone, and then another 100%. So we could, in this case, if you wanted to do something like that, we could widen it out. But basically, the vignette tool allows you to create blur, and it also allows you to create a vignette. So we can set that about there. We could add a little blur, and now she's more isolated. Okay. The difference with the vignette tool is, the vignette tool only works in circles. You can make the circle bigger or smaller. You can move it, but it only works with circles. The other difference between the vignette tool and the lens blur tool is that the vignette tool has an outer brightness and an inner brightness. So right now it says outer brightness minus 73. You can set that to minus 50, for example, and then we could turn up the inner brightness, and that would make the area just around her face a bit brighter. Okay, so those are the two differences. Vignette tool only does circles, but it has an inner brightness and outer brightness, and the lens blur tool is basically either a radial gradient or a linear gradient. Okay, we're running out of tools. Double exposure we'll come back to. Actually, no, we'll do double exposure right now. Okay, so to do this, you pick 2 images. So we'll take this one. This is an image I shot last fall at Royal Roads University. And this is an image I shot about 30 seconds later, also at Royal Roads University, obviously. It has Marcia in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this image, and then we're going to go to Tools, Double Exposure, and down on the bottom we're going to click on the plus, and we're going to pick a second image, this one. Okay. So now with the second image, we can move it around. We can make it bigger or smaller, rotate it. And over here on the right, there's a little water droplet sort of thing. We can decide whether we want mostly Marcia, mostly background, somewhere in between. Okay. We've also got different blend modes. Now, blend modes are basically just curves. They're preset curves, but they do different things. So the darken curve doesn't do much for us in this case. Add, subtract, definitely not. Overlay, not bad. But in this particular case, I'd probably stick with the default. And then I would change the ratio, something like that. Okay, so that's the double exposure. Cancel that. Okay, I'm going to skip over text for just a second, and I'm going to go to frames. And frames are what they say they are. You have white frames and you have black frames, and they have different edge definitions. And if I pick that one, for example, Again, you've got the crossed arrows. So by clicking on it, let's pick something more obvious. By clicking on it, you can change what the look of the frame is, depending on which frame you're looking at. Let's pick this one, for example. Okay, so you can change the look of the frame. By moving your slider left to right up top, it says frame width -10. That's the default. But we can make the frame thicker or narrower. So if you remember back to the rotation tool and the perspective tool, and when we rotated the images using the perspective tool, we had the option of filling in the triangles with white, black, or content aware fill. And I mentioned sometimes, depending on the level of detail, that sometimes the blend didn't work so well. You can either crop that off, or if you're planning on using a frame, you can add a frame and just cover up those mistakes so that nobody can see them. It's all fair. Okay, so that's the tool. That's the text. And okay, so now we're going to go and talk about text. And one thing that Marcia and I do with some regularity is we'll make up cards for people rather than going to PharmaSave or Staples or wherever and buying cards. We have our own blank card stock, and we'll print out usually 4x6 prints and make our own cards. So this one, for example, I made a thank you card. So very quickly, we'll just I'm just going to use the auto tone, maybe increase the ambience a little bit, and then we'll use the rotate tool. Something like that. And we'll use the crop tool. And if we're going to make a 4x6 print, we'll need a 3x2. Take off that little fingertip there. Crop that like that. Okay, so now we're ready for the text tool. So we click on tools and click on text. Okay, so now you've got a number of different fonts that you can use. And then after that, you've got these little embellishments, if you will. There's a whole whack of them, depending on what you're looking for. Okay, so for this particular image, we're just going to use something that looks like writing, like maybe that one. So it says double tap here to change the text. So we'll double tap on that, and we'll say, why is my keyboard is not working? There we go. Okay, so get rid of that. We'll say thank you. We're going to make this into a thank you card. Looking for the dash. There it is. Okay. So now we can do a couple of things with this. One is if we click on the palette, we have a number of different colors that we can use, from white to black to yellow. In my Waterman pen, I have a lovely purple ink called Violette Pensée, so we're going to use that one. Then we're going to take this text and we're going to rotate it using 2 fingers. And we'll just kind of stick it over there by the pen somewhere. May have to rotate it a bit more, but you get the idea. So there. Okay. And now we've got an image that we can use for a thank you card. Another example would be, this is an image I made up at Tofino a couple of years ago. And so this to me looks like a good anniversary card. So we'll go to tools and we'll go to text, and we can use the same purple, and maybe we'll choose a different font. Maybe this one. and we'll delete the text, and we'll say happy anniversary. I don't know who they are, but whoever they are, they're having a happy anniversary. Okay, so we can make this bigger by doing the 2-finger stretch. In this case, I don't think we need to rotate it, but we have that same water droplet in the middle, and we can fade out the text or bring it back. But also there's a button here that says invert. If we click that, then we end up with text but no image. But we can also bring this back. So now we have a lovely purple overlay to our image. Okay. Now you can't do more than one line of text with the text tool. It's not Photoshop. But what you can do is you can reuse the same tool over again, and we can go back here and pick the same font. Go down here and double tap and say have a wonderful day. Okay, so now we've got the same. Let's move that down a little bit. I guess it was centered. Okay, now we have the same gradient here, but it's not going to help us in this case. Even if we turn that off, it's just not going to work. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to pick a different font color. So maybe something like, no, not quite that one. Maybe that one. That's a bit bright. But here we can take that and we can tone it down just a little bit and kind of line up with the other one. Now, all right, so that's an example of the text tool. Now we're coming up to, I seem to get stuck on 2 hours. I was going to do some more advanced editing and show you what this is capable of, but we're not going to do that. But there is a couple more things I want to show you. One of the, it's not a disadvantage or an advantage, it is simply what it is in Snapseed, is that when you've created an image, like this one, for example, if you wanted to apply that to another image, as soon as you save it and open another image, like if I was to open another image right now, it will say all changes will be lost. Okay, so there's no way of keeping the changes that you've made. I mean, you can export the image and you will have the image that you've processed, but there's no way of keeping the steps that you've gone through to create that image. Or is there? Actually, there is. Okay, back at the very beginning, we talked about styles. Okay, we talked about all the different styles that are built in. Okay, if you keep going to the right, oh, there's a plus sign. If we hit that, we can now save this look. So this particular look only has 2 sliders to it, but it doesn't matter. We can call this anniversary card. Save. Okay, so now we have a style called anniversary card. So if we click open and go to our gallery and pick a different image, or we'll pick the same image, it doesn't matter because that's the way it started. But we want to recreate what we just done. We go to styles, we go all the way over here, We click that, and voila, we've kept all of our steps. Now, there's two other things to know about. One is up here, we've got open, and then beside open, we've got a little square with a back arrow. If you click on that, you have an undo, which is to undo your last step, which in our case would be to undo the style that we've just applied. Revert, which would take your image back to the original where it was when you opened it with Snapseed. View edits, which we'll come to in a minute, and QR look. Now, QR codes never really gained popularity in North America. They're very popular in Asia. In Japan, I can send you money using a QR code. Marcia's book has a QR code on it, and if you scan the code with your phone, it'll take you to the website where you can buy the book. So QR codes are basically a little square of squares, and they're used to transfer information. Now, if I created a style like I just did in Snapseed, and I wanted to share those settings with you, I can click on QR look, create QR look, and voila, that's a QR code. Okay, so I could click share and text it to you or email it to you or whatever, and all you would have to do is scan that code, and it would automatically add that style to your Snapseed. Okay, it's kind of handy, really. And if I go back to QR look, there's a scan QR look. Okay, so I don't happen to have a QR code to scan in the moment, but that's what it does. Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to show you, and then we've gone 2 hours, so I'm going to have to close out. But let's open up an image here and go to gallery, and let's pick on this image. Actually, no, let's pick on this image. This is a raw file made with the Nikon D5000, and I'm just going to auto white balance it. Okay, so we'll go to tools, we'll go to tune image, and we'll process it a little bit. Too high, much too high. There we go. Saturation right there. Increase the ambience. Yeah. Highlights are okay. Shadows are good. Okay. So let's go to tools. We'll crop it. We'll do a vertical crop. And we'll go to lens blur, and we'll just kind of focus on that dragonfly and highlight him. Okay, so we've made, and then just for laughs, we'll add a frame to it. Like that one, maybe a little bit bigger. Okay, so that was our original image. That's officially now our processed image of this blue darner. But let's say we get to this point and we think to ourselves, you know what? I would really like to change something. So what you can do is you click on that and you go to View Edits. And now on the right-hand side, you have all of the editing steps that you've made for this image. Okay. So there's a couple of things you can do here. If I go back to Tune Image, that takes me back to this point. And if I, up here on the top left, there's an arrow. If I exit out at this point, that's what it's going to do. That's taking my image back to that point. I don't necessarily want to do that. but there's a little arrow beside it. And if I click on that arrow, I can do three things. One is I can delete that processing step without affecting the others. The second slider, this middle one, is the brush tool, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then there's the sliders. And if I click on the sliders, I'm right back where I was. I had shadows at plus 50. Let's say I decide the shadows are too bright. I want to darken the shadows a little bit, maybe to about 32. And I decide I'm going to increase the ambiance maybe a little bit more. And I've decided the saturation is too high. So pull that back to about 6. I click OK. So now I've re-edited this image at that point. If I wanted to change the crop, I could go in and do the same thing. Now the brush tool is interesting because let's click back on frames, and that takes us back to where we were, and then we'll hit the left arrow. We'll go back into tools, we'll go to tune image, and this time we're going to take the brightness and we're going to tone it down, all the way down. Okay, click OK. So now we've got an image that looks like this. Now this is exaggerated. This is much more than you would normally do, but I wanted to illustrate the point. If I go back to view edits, go back to tune image, and you can see that my brightness slider is at 100%. That's fine. But this time we're going to hit the brush tool. Now, you've got on the bottom here, you've got an eyeball. And the eyeball shows the mask that you're about to create. Okay? You've got increments of 25%. So, and this is, this relates to the effect. It's not lightening or darkening the image. It could be saturation. It could be whatever. It's the effect related to that tool that you're using. So in this particular case, we darkened the image, but we only want to darken part of the image. Okay, so let's start picking out the dragonfly here. And again, the brush tool in Snapseed is not very specific. But let's invert that. And then you can see it switched from 100 to 0. So let's go back to 100. And we'll start maybe getting a little bit closer to the dragonfly. Anyway, this is very quick, but you get the idea. So let's zoom back out. What happens when we turn the eyeball off? Now that 100%, negative 100% brightness that we've added is affecting the entire image except for the dragonfly because we've added a mask around it. Okay? We zoom back in. You can see we've got a bit of a mask. Oops, let's take that back down to 0. We just pull that out of there. There. So now, if we go back and zoom back out, we've created a little highlight spot on our dragonfly. So there's much more that you can do, and as I say, I expected to cover the first part in about an hour, but it's been 2 hours and 10 minutes, so I'm going to let you all go. And I'm just going to export that, so save. And when you click save, it's going to go through all of the steps, and it's going to process them, and then it's saved. So if I go back to my gallery, I now have a Snapseed gallery with one image in it. That looks like that. Okay. So thank you all for hanging in there. And that's it for now. If you have any questions, you can always message me through Meetup, and I'd be happy to answer them as best I can. And that's about it. And as I mentioned to Dee earlier, this is being recorded, and as soon as we're done here, then I'm going to go and eat some supper and but the video will be available at this same URL. It's considered an unlisted link, which means that anybody can who wants to, God knows why they would, but anybody who wants to can watch the video, but you do need the actual URL to find it. If you go to YouTube and type in Mike Nelson Petty image processing with Snapseed, it won't come up. Okay, so there we go. Thanks very much and have a great night. Bye now.